This might be my most controversial Percy Jackson YouTube video to date. Real quick, before we get into the video, I want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon. I want to make sure you guys know that I'm starting to post stuff over there. I'm posting my full reaction videos to the Percy Jackson episodes, along with I'm going to be doing commentary tracks of the episodes so I can talk about specific things in the episode and you guys can watch along with me. Also, I'm going to be doing reactions and commentary tracks for more than just Percy Jackson. I'm big into a lot of other fandoms. I'm really big into Marvel. I'm big into Star Wars, Bridgerton, Stranger Things, all that jazz. There's a whole lot of stuff that I'm going to be watching and doing commentary tracks for, so make sure you go subscribe to my Patreon so you don't miss out on any of that because it's going to be a fun time. But let's get into the video. Hey guys, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today we are going to be talking about some of the very surface level critiques and criticisms that the Percy Jackson show got a lot of while it was airing on Disney+. I've talked about these critiques a lot here and there in a whole bunch of my videos. I feel like I slightly addressed them throughout my reviews of the show, and I definitely talked about them a lot in my episode ranking that I did 2 weeks ago. I've been wanting to make a video specifically for them because every time I see or think about the very surface level critiques that the show got, it makes me angry. Now, I'm using the term surface level critique on purpose because even though I clearly enjoy the show very much, I don't think it's perfect. I don't think any show is perfect. I think everything, shows, movies, books, everything can be critiqued. Nothing is ever perfect. There's always stuff that people can improve on. I don't think the show is perfect. I think that the show has quite a few things that it could definitely improve on in its following seasons. But when I say surface level critiques, I'm talking about mostly TikTok, a little bit of Reddit. I'm talking about the critiques where a lot of people will see one person say something and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds good. I'm gonna say that as well. But they're not really fully understanding what their critique means, or they're not really thinking about it. And I don't mean to sound like a language arts teacher because that's not what I want to sound like. And I don't want to make the general statement and say oh, people lack media literacy, because that's not true. A lot of people do have media literacy and they're good at it. And I am also not the most media literate person you'll ever meet. I feel as though I'm very intelligent. I'm very well versed when it comes to media literacy, I guess you could say. I watch a lot of things. I think about a lot of things deeply. I have a lot of conversations with friends about these things. But what I think it is I feel like a lot of people, and again, not to single out TikTok, because there are a lot of people on TikTok that are smart, and I'm not saying people aren't smart, but I just feel like it's very lazy thinking. If I'm not making sense right now, let me give you an example of what I'm trying to say. So if you watch the Percy Jackson show and you come away from it and you're like, I didn't like that show, I hated the writing. That's a very general and broad statement. What I wish more people would do is reel it back in and think for a second. Be like, oh, okay, well, I didn't hate the writing in every episode. I just didn't like episodes 4 and 6. What is it about episodes 4 and 6 that I don't like? It's the writing. I don't like the writings in 4 and 6. Okay, let me go look and see who the writer for those episodes were. Oh, it was the same guy who wrote both 4 and 6? And he's not coming back for season 2? Oh, okay, that's great. Good to know. I didn't like his writing style. His writing style wasn't for me. I wish him luck, but I'm glad he's not coming back from season 2. So there's a difference between being I didn't like the writing in the Percy Jackson show versus being I didn't like Joe Track's writing for episodes 4 and 6. Those are very different statements to me, and I respect the second statement a little bit more because there's a lot more thought put into it. You've got specifics to back it up. So a statement like that, I can respect, I can get behind. Obviously, I'm using my own statement as an example. If you watched my episode ranking video, I didn't really like episodes 4 and 6 all that much compared to other episodes, and those episodes had the same writer. But so when a complaint or critique can have some validity behind it, it can have some sort of research behind it, you have points to back up your statement without just making general and broad statements back to back to back. Those are the kind of critiques I like Those are the kind of complaints and critiques I can get behind. What we're going to be tackling today are the very broad, very general, very surface level critiques that the show got a lot during its run. I'm going to talk about if I agree with them or if I disagree with them, and I'm going to talk about why I disagree with them. This is going to be a long video, and you might get mad at me if I disagree with a complaint that you have, but that's totally fine, because at the end of the day, this is all opinion based. Totally all opinion based. Something that's really hard about media is I feel like a lot of people forget that it is all very subjective. You can watch the Percy Jackson show and absolutely hate everything that you just saw, but that's what it was like to you, to other people, to me. It wasn't bad and it wasn't trash, and it's all very subjective and it's all very based in your own opinions. You kind of just have to remember that it's subjective. If I say something that you disagree with, don't get mad in the comments. It's okay. It's all okay. It's just a TV show. Huge shout out to the people on Twitter and the people in my community tab on YouTube who helped me come up with some of these surface level critiques. It's been a while since the show came out, so I needed a refresher of what the common complaints were from people watching it. So if you responded to my tweet or if you commented on my community post, thank you. You're the best. So first, we're going to tackle, I think, the most common complaint that at least I saw on TikTok. We're going to tackle the show don't tell and the exposition dumps. I'm kind of lumping them into one thing because I feel like they kind of go hand in hand. So TikTok obviously had its complaints about this at the time. I saw somebody on Reddit say this, and I'm going to quote what they said. They said, "I cringe every time one of the characters recites lore and it sounds like they're reading from a Wikipedia article." That quote specifically reminds me of why I was kind of irritated or confused with the exposition dump complaint in the show. We're going to get into some specific examples in a second, but like generally what I feel like people were classifying as exposition dumps were like moments where two characters were just having a long-winded conversation, or like when somebody was telling a story about Greek mythology, which I think is kind of crazy. The exposition dump complaint irritated me just because you're watching a show based in Greek mythology. What do you think Greek mythology is? It's just stories. That's all Greek mythology is. For example, in episode 5, when they're in the Tunnel of Love and they see the Golden Throne, Percy starts to talk about Hephaestus and Hera and the story of the Golden Throne and how Hephaestus made it for like Hera to sit in and to trap her. I don't really classify that as an exposition dump. You can, but it doesn't feel like a useless one or an irritating one. When I'm watching a show that's based in Greek mythology, I go into it fully expecting to hear stories about Greek mythology. Like, that's just what I would expect out of it. So to hear these demigod children talk about Greek mythological stories, that makes sense to me. I'm fine with that. And it doesn't feel like a burden to hear them talk about it. Same thing with them talking about Odysseus when they're in the Lotus Casino. Stuff like that makes sense. I think that complaining about characters talking about Greek mythology in a show that is heavily rooted in Greek mythology is a weird thing to complain about. Now, if you want to get into specific exposition dumps, I can think of 2 examples that I know a lot of people talked about. The first one is Grover's exposition dump in the car on the way to Camp Half-Blood with Sally and Percy. I talked about this a little bit in my episode ranking video, but that whole monologue is not an exposition dump for the audience. I think the only time that exposition dumps can feel annoying or feel stupid is when it's done specifically for the audience. But in that scene, Percy himself as a character is confused. Percy does not know what's going on. Percy needs that exposition dump from Grover to understand where they're going, what's going on, why is Grover a goat. Grover explains we're going to Camp Half-Blood, you're a demigod, explains the mist. Like, those are critical things for Percy to learn about at that point in time. So although it is technically defined as an exposition dump, I feel like there's a difference between a useful exposition dump and an unuseful one, and that one is useful because it's not just for the audience, it's for Percy. If you're a book reader and Grover's giving this exposition dump, you're like, yeah, I know this. Duh. You don't need to tell me this, I know this. But that's because you've read the book. Imagine being somebody who has never seen a Percy Jackson movie, read a Percy Jackson book, or knows anything about Percy Jackson. Grover talking in that scene is actually incredibly useful if you don't know anything about this world. And it's also useful for Percy in that scene. Now, another exposition dump that happens is when Luke is talking to Percy about Thalia. He's like telling the whole story about how it used to be Luke, Annabeth, and Thalia, and telling the story about how they got to Camp Half-Blood. This is another one I kind of talked about before, and someone in my comments actually made a really good point. I said originally, I was like, would it have been nice to see a flashback while Luke is narrating the flashback of like Luke and baby Annabeth and Thalia running up the hill being chased by the Furies? Yes, in a perfect world, it would have been really cool to see a flashback while Luke is talking, but that's a little hard to do considering the fact that they couldn't really cast Thalia this early because we don't see Thalia until the end of season 2, and she's not supposed to age at all since she gets turned to a tree. So it would be really hard to have an actor cast as Thalia at the beginning of season 1, and then we don't see her again until season 2. Like, she would have aged. She would have obviously aged when she's technically not supposed to. Someone in my comments made a really good point where they're like, if they wanted to, they could have done a flashback and not really shown Thalia's face. That's absolutely correct. So I will give this exposition dump, I'll give you guys that. They could have, if they really wanted to, done a Thalia flashback. They could have just like made it dark. We couldn't really see Thalia's face. Maybe we could only just hear her, but we could see Luke and we could see a baby Annabeth. They could have given us that flashback if they wanted to. They didn't, and that sucks. But like, I can understand why they didn't go through the hassle of doing that, if that makes sense, just because of the casting of Thalia is a tricky and difficult thing to do. But that does lead me into my next point of people being like, the show does too much telling, not enough showing. I actually disagree. The show does show quite a lot of stuff. We get a whole lot of flashbacks in the show between Percy and Sally, Percy and Poseidon, Luke and Percy. We have a lot of flashbacks actually that do a really great job at showing us important character relationships for Percy. They could have easily just told us about Sally and Poseidon or whatever, but they decided to give us a flashback in episode 7, show us their dynamic, show us how they communicate. Same with Percy and Sally. They didn't have to dive so heavily into the relationship between Percy and his mom. They could have just been like, Percy loves his mom. They could have just had Percy saying throughout the show, I miss my mom, I love my mom. But instead, they decided to show us multiple flashbacks, showing us their relationship and showing how important Sally is to Percy, how much she cares about Percy, how much she's done and sacrificed for her son. And they could have just told us that Luke taught Percy how to sword fight. They didn't have to show us that, but they did show us that in episode 8 of the show. So Percy Jackson actually does a lot of showing. They may not be showing what you specifically wanted to see, if that makes sense. Maybe you wanted like to see certain Greek stories being told, or you wanted to see certain flashbacks of Thalia and whatnot. And I can understand that and I can respect that. But like I said at the beginning of this video, you have to sit back and think for a second what you're specifically saying in your critique of the show. Does the show not do any showing and only does telling? Or is the show just not showing what you specifically wanted to see? I do think that the show does a lot of showing. They also do a lot of telling. And I think that, yeah, maybe in next season they can dial down exposition dumps a little bit. I think, in my opinion, any sort of exposition dump in season 1 didn't quite bother me because it's the first season of a show. There's a lot of groundwork to lay. There's a lot of world to build. Percy Jackson is entering this world for the first time, same as the audience. So exposition dumps sometimes can be necessary, even if they feel annoying. But I think as the show goes on, as Percy gets used to being in this world, as we, the audience, gets used to being in this world, they can definitely tone down the exposition dumps. And I think they definitely can work on showing more things than just telling. But the show does show stuff. I know I'm saying the word show a lot right now. I can hear it. Don't worry. I do think that the Percy Jackson TV show does show. It doesn't just tell. It does show things. It just may not be showing what you specifically wanted to see. The next complaint that we're going to talk about is the fact that people thought that there wasn't enough action in the show. And by this, I assume people mean like the fight with the Chimera, the fight with Medusa, the fights with all of the monsters that the trio encounters throughout the show. Now, in my opinion, if Percy was incredible in these fights and was just so badass, like straight out of the gate, people would then turn and complain that Percy Jackson is a little too overpowered. I think that as Percy develops throughout the 5 books, we see him control and learn his powers a whole lot more, and he becomes a whole lot more confident with like his water powers and whatnot. But in season 1, when Percy's been a demigod for like less than a week, I'm okay with him not being the best fighter we've ever seen. We see the roots of his fighting abilities and his fighting instincts in his fight with Clarice in episode 2. So he's like near water, so like that kind of helps him and makes him a little bit stronger. He has good instincts. He can fight. He just needs to be able to build off of that so that when he's in these real world scenarios, he's a good fighter. And we're gonna see him like build that up as he grows. But I think some people were complaining about fight scenes that were done in the way that they were done specifically. For example, I feel like certain fight scenes warranted very small and like crammed fights. For example, fighting the Furies on the bus or fighting the Chimera in the St. Louis Arch. Both of those settings are very crammed areas. Like there's not a whole lot that you can do. You don't have a lot of surface area to work with. You're in a crammed and small space. So I think those fights being short makes sense. What are you going to do? Watch Percy run from the Chimera multiple times just to make the fight sequence longer? He's also dying, by the way. Like, those fight scenes made sense to me. Same thing with Medusa. The Medusa fight scene was less about fighting her, more about outsmarting her, and that's exactly what the trio did. And I feel like all of the fight scenes were a little dialed down on purpose because we were leading up to the fight scene between Percy and Ares. That scene is where Percy has his first, like, real big usage of power with crashing a wave onto Ares. And that's an iconic moment for Percy Jackson. So I think that they were building up to that on purpose. I personally didn't feel a lack of action. I can understand if you're somebody that did, but I don't think that that's a major critique of the show. I think as the show goes on, the type of monsters and the things that Percy encounters become grander and grander just as the books progress. So I think that that's already something that's going to be air quote fixed if you feel like it needed fixing as the show goes on. So I don't really think that's too big of a critique of the show. I can understand if you were like, oh yeah, I felt a little underwhelmed by some of the fight scenes, but I don't think that that's a big enough reason to like say that the show is bad, if that makes sense. The next complaint that we're going to talk about is people saying that the show was not funny. First and foremost, humor is subjective. In any show ever, there are always going to be jokes that some people find funny and some people don't find funny. That's just how life is. Your sense of humor and what you find funny depends on a lot of personal things like your age, your gender, just like personal things that happened in your life up to this point. Humor is like the most subjective thing. So to say the show isn't funny enough, you can say the show wasn't funny to me. The show wasn't my sense of humor. Those are statements that like you can fully make. That's fine because that's your opinion and totally subjective to you. If you didn't find the show funny, who am I to tell you that you're wrong? But it's the way you phrase it. You can't just make a factual statement and say the show's not funny because that's not a fact. If other people found it funny, then the show is funny. It's just not funny to you. So when it comes to this complaint or critique, you have to word it in the correct way, in my opinion. Like you have to be like, oh, the show wasn't funny to me. You can't just be like, the show was not funny enough. There was no humor in the show. Well, that's not true because I laughed. So what was I laughing at if there was no humor? There was humor. It's just not your type of humor, and that's okay. That's totally okay. And then when it comes to the humor in the show, like there's also the added issue that comes with we're not in Percy's head in the show. When you read the book, you're in Percy's first person perspective. You're in his head. A lot of Percy's sassy moments in the book are just his thoughts. And we read it in the book and we're like, that's funny. But in the show, it's no longer first person, it's third person. I personally felt like Percy's sassiness came across really well in the show. I feel like even when there were moments where Percy wasn't saying anything, Walker had a really good sassy sort of face. I think that Walker did a really good job at portraying Percy's like sort of sassy and sarcastic moments with his facial expressions. But again, that's just me. I know that there were some certain jokes that were in the book that people were really mad that they cut out. Like for example, I think there was like a joke in the underworld that Percy makes that he didn't make in the show and people were upset about that. But you know, That's fine. If it's your favorite joke that didn't make it into the show, I get that. I really wanted Poseidon to say the line about Percy's mom being like a goddess amongst mortals or whatever, and he didn't say that, and that upset me. So I totally get it if like one of your favorite lines from the book did not make it into the show. But I still think that the show was very funny. Okay, the next critique that we're going to get into is I think one of the biggest ones that the show got. So strap in. We're going to talk about how people were saying that the trio was too smart in the show. Now, I think the number one thing that I feel about this critique is that there were changes in the script made so that when the trio was going into these traps that they go into, they were fully aware of where they were going and what they were doing before they got there, which is very unlike the book. So I'm actually going to talk about like specific traps that happen in the show and whether or not I like how they did it or not. Starting out with Medusa, I fully liked every change made to the Medusa scene. None of the changes bother me, and I don't have any complaints about them. I remember when I read The Lightning Thief for the first time being so annoyed at how obvious it was that they were walking into Medusa's like lair, and the trio was just like, oh, hey, look at these statues. That's crazy. Oh, hey, look at that sign that says anti-M's. Huh, weird. And like, they just weren't putting it together. I remember being so annoyed reading that in the book, and it took them so long through their conversation with Medusa to realize who they were talking to. So I'm really glad that the show changed it. I was actually very happy that that change happened, and I liked that they were fully aware that it was Medusa before they walked into the house, because if they didn't, I'd be like, these kids are so stupid. I'd rather have the kids be smart than have them be embarrassingly dumb. The next trap is, I think, the Tunnel of Love. I don't really consider Echidna to be a trap. We'll talk about the St. Louis Arch in a different point, but the next trap I'm going to talk about is the Tunnel of Love. This trap is completely different from how it is in the book, so it's kind of hard to critique it in terms of, oh, the kids were too smart. I liked the changes made to the Tunnel of Love scene. I think that the trap that was in the Tunnel of Love scene was really cool, and I think it was visually stunning, and I think it added a lot to the characters of Percy and Annabeth. And I don't necessarily think that they were too smart when it came to that trap. The only reason that they got out of that trap is because Annabeth was able to convince Hephaestus to change his mind. I don't even think she really meant to convince him to change his mind. She was very determined to figure that chair out and to undo what had happened to Percy. But her speech to Hephaestus had him change his mind, and he blew his little pipe and let Percy out of the chair. So that was more of like a character development moment for Annabeth, in my opinion, than it was them being too smart. I think that they were just normal. If they were too smart, they would have found a way to get that shield down without anybody sitting in the chair. But they didn't do that. They just walked right into the trap, and they did exactly what Hephaestus wanted them to do. Next, you have the Lotus Casino, and I know that everybody has their own individual gripes with the Lotus Casino. I don't mind the changes made, again, to the Lotus Casino scene. The episode 6 is like I think my least favorite episode of the show, but that's not to say that I didn't like it. I had a fun time watching it. But when it comes to the kids being too smart and being on alert when they walk into the Lotus Casino, I have many thoughts on that. Number one, in the show, Ares sends them specifically to the Lotus Casino to find Hermes because they need a ride to get to like Los Angeles. So the trio is going to the casino on purpose. In the book, the trio accidentally stumbles upon the casino in Las Vegas, unintentional. They did not mean to do it, and they stumble in without really knowing what they're walking into. So this is what I mean when I say there were changes made in the script so that the trio knew where they were going before they got there. So they had time to think about where they were going, unlike in the book where a lot of these traps happen because the trio just accidentally stumbles into them. Another trap that people thought the trio was too smart for was Krusty. See, now I would have been okay with this scene being not only just cut out of the show, but cut out of the book. I don't care about the Krusty scene. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you know I've talked before about how I didn't care for the Krusty scene when I read the book, and I thought it was going to get cut out of the show, but they kept it in the show, and I still don't care. So it's hard for me to have any sort of debate over this scene, or even be bothered to defend it because I didn't care about it when I read it. But it's the same reasoning as the casino for me. They went into Krusty's for a reason, because Hermes sent them there because it's a backdoor entrance to the underworld. Unlike in the book, they accidentally end up in Krusty's because people are chasing them through the streets of Los Angeles or something, and they're trying to hide from them. So it's less that the trio was too smart, it's more that the script changes Like, gave them prep time. You know how people always ask, like, oh, who wins in a fight, Batman or Iron Man? And then the follow-up question is, well, like, how much prep time does Batman have? The trio had prep time in this show for all of these traps. They had prep time to think about where they were going. They had the whole truck ride to Las Vegas to think about the Lotus Casino. And Lotus has something to do with Odysseus. They're smart kids. They can put those puzzle pieces together if they have time to think about it. Same thing for Krusty. If they're going to this place that they know is a backdoor entrance to the underworld, and it's called Krusty, these kids are smart. They have time to think about where they're going. Krusty, Procrustes, or whatever his name is, they're smart. They can put that together if they have time. The difference is that in the book, they don't have time to put those things together, and that's why the traps, I guess, sort of feel more like traps in the book. To me, I didn't really care that the trio had prep time and they were aware of these things as they were going into them. Honestly, I specifically love it for the Krusty scene because it made the scene go by faster. And I don't care about the Krusty scene. But I can understand if you like really wanted the kids to get super trapped. I think that that's something that's going to be fixed as the show goes on. I think that this was one of the most voiced critiques by a lot of people. I know a lot of people who also weren't bothered by it, but I know I saw a lot of people on TikTok that were bothered by it. So I'm sure like as the show goes on, like when we get season 2, a lot of the traps that happen are not going to be things that they're too smart to figure out. I don't think they're going to be too smart for Cersei's Island, honestly. I am very much looking forward to seeing Percy get turned into a guinea pig, and I think they're going to walk right into that one, and they're not going to really be smart enough for it. So I think as the things that the kids encounter become more and more serious throughout the books, like the kids are gonna not be as smart as a lot of people were complaining they are. I also feel like the writers definitely saw this complaint and they'll probably take it into account next season, and some of it will be fixed. I think some of it will still be like how it was in The Lightning Thief, where there might be like a script change and the trio might know what they're about to go into before they go into it, but I'm sure the writers saw this complaint and will definitely take it into account when writing season 2. Another complaint that I saw like under this general category that I am confused on actually, I've seen a lot of people say that Annabeth is getting the Hermione treatment from Hermione from Harry Potter. And I find that interesting because they're saying that as if, one, that's a bad thing, which I don't think it is. I love Hermione Granger. I think she's badass. And 2, people are acting like that's not how it is in the book. It's incredibly common to have a trio of 2 boys and 1 girl, and the girl is the smart one. Many reasons. Number 1, it's just easier to write it that way. And number 2, hey, girls are smart. Also, she's daughter of Athena, so of course she's going to be the smart one. I don't understand people trying to say Annabeth is getting this Hermione treatment like it's a bad thing and like she's not the smartest one in the book. And that's not to say that Percy and Grover aren't also smart. I think they are also smart. And I think they're portrayed as smart in the show as well. Like Grover is the one that figures out the Lotus Casino. He's the one that's like, wait, Percy, did your mom ever read you the Odyssey? Like, he puts that together first. I think they're all smart, but I think it's weird that people are trying to call out Annabeth for being like way too smart and getting the Hermione treatment. I don't know. I just think that that's a weird one. Given the fact that the script was changed to allow the kids like some prep time before going into these certain traps, I think they were just the right amount of smart. When you're a demigod and you know that you live a dangerous life, and not to mention, Percy is a child of the big 3, so he's in even more danger than Annabeth is. Like, monsters are even more attracted to children of the big 3. When you're a demigod and you know that you live your life in constant danger, I feel like you really do need to be on guard, like 24/7. Like, you need to be aware of your surroundings and you need to know what's going on. And also it helps to know Greek mythology because you have to learn about your family. So these kids being smart, these kids being on their A game, these kids being fully aware of their surroundings doesn't really bother me. It makes sense to me. I think I would be far more irritated if they were stupid. If they were stupid, I don't think I would have as much fun watching the show. I'd be like, oh my God, can you guys like put 2 and 2 together for once? The next common complaint we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about this very broadly because this is, I think, a very deep subject that I could probably honestly make a whole separate video on, which I probably will because people have asked me to, is the changes that were made from the book to the show. One thing I saw the most of that really annoyed me was people complaining, and like this is like a direct quote, Uncle Rick promised us a book accurate show and we didn't get that. Actually, you did. we did get a book accurate show. The definition of accurate, like the Webster's Dictionary definition of accurate, is going to, reaching, or hitting the intended target. Book accurate does not mean a one-to-one adaptation of a book. It does not. Adaptation itself means a form or structure modified to fit a changed environment. There are a lot of things that do not translate well from a book to a screenplay, especially if your book is in first-person narration and your screenplay is not. Unironically, like for fun, I've been writing a screenplay for one of my favorite books, like just in my free time. Not seriously, but like I'm taking it seriously, but it's not going anywhere. Like no one's gonna see it ever. It's just for me. I've been writing a screenplay of one of my favorite books, like just for fun. And it's actually incredibly hard to adapt things from a book into a screenplay. Like there's lots of changes that have to be made, whether they're big or small, to make things flow easier. There's actually a whole lot that goes into it that I feel like the common audience doesn't think about or doesn't really understand. And I'm not even a professional screenplay writer, obviously. If I showed my script to a professional script writer, they'd probably read it and laugh in my face. Like I am by no means a professional when it comes to writing a script, but I can tell you, trying to take a book and adapt it into a script is actually a whole lot harder than you think it is. The way that a book flows is not the way that a TV show flows, not in the slightest. I actually encourage you, if you have a lot of free time, take one of your favorite books and try to write a screenplay of it. It is not as easy as it looks. And the book that I'm writing a screenplay of is actually in the third person, so it's a little bit easier than taking a first-person book. Percy Jackson is first-person narration. We don't even know if Percy Jackson is a reliable narrator, mind you. He could be a completely unreliable narrator. He kind of is an unreliable narrator because he basically, anytime he sees a girl that's not Annabeth, he's like, she's ugly. He describes Clarice as like ugly. We don't know if we can trust that. That's just Percy's thoughts. That's just how Percy feels, but that's not fact. So like a whole lot doesn't adapt well when you're changing the environment of this story, changing the environment from a book to a TV show, even changing the environment from a book to a movie. Like it's never going to be one-to-one because certain things just do not translate well. And I think that that's something a lot of people do not get. Now I understand certain things in the book that are easy to translate over and they chose not to do it. I get that. Especially if it's something that you were really looking forward to seeing and they didn't do, it got cut. Like I can understand being upset by that. So I'm actually gonna briefly talk about a few things that were changed from the book that I know a lot of people had issues with and whether or not I had issues with it. One of the issues that a lot of people had that actually shocked me, I didn't think a lot of people would have this big of an issue with it, is Gabe not being physically abusive to Sally. I didn't expect people to really find issue with that, but a lot of people did. I personally love the way that Sally was written in this show. I think that the way that they took her character and changed her for the show, changed her for the better. I did not expect to like Sally Jackson as much as I did, but I love her. I really, really love her. And to see people complain like Gabe wasn't physically abusive enough, weird complaint in my opinion, sorry. And to complain like, oh, Sally Jackson was too much of a girl boss. Those are kind of weird complaints to me. I also hate when the word girl boss is like used in a derogatory way because that's not what the word was originally intended for. And it just like has become a negative thing and I don't think it is. Maybe I'm a girl boss. Sorry. But I don't think being a strong woman is a negative thing. I think that seeing Sally like low-key kind of stand up to Gabe and being like, if you don't let us take your car, like I will only get myself a sandwich and I'll watch like the basketball game like by myself or whatever that scene was. I thought that was cool. I liked seeing that. I think that by the time the show ended, the way that Gabe turned to stone, like it all made sense and it was good. I'd rather not see a nice character get physically abused, honestly. And that was just like a weird thing to see so many people really, really complain about when Gabe is only in the show for one season. He's really not all that important. We really should just be looking forward to Paul coming in. And also, you know, The Lightning Thief was written 20 years ago. Society's gone through a lot since then. We've gone through things like the Me Too movement and just so much stuff where like, you know, we don't really need to see a female character get physically abused. I was fine with that change. I was absolutely fine with that change. You've got the change of Luke showing Percy around camp instead of Annabeth. I enjoyed this change. I think that it added a lot to the relationship between Luke and Percy, because realistically, we have 5 seasons to build up the relationship between Percy and Annabeth. They're kind of pretty much by each other's side the whole time except for the Titan's Curse. So we have a lot of time to build up the relationship between Percy and Annabeth, and they already did such a good job of that in season 1 in the first place. But I think that building the relationship between Percy and Luke, specifically in season 1, is incredibly important, just because we want to see that relationship so that we can fully understand the downfall of it by the time Luke reveals that he's working with Kronos at the end of the season. And seeing Luke show Percy around, seeing Luke sort of be a mentor figure to Percy was, I think, incredibly beneficial to their relationship, and I think it had a lot of payoff by the end of the show. One complaint that I really didn't get at all, people were complaining that Annabeth was not into architecture, which I disagree. People thought that having the St. Louis Arch be a temple for Athena instead of just going to the St. Louis Arch because Annabeth loves architecture, like, diminished how much she loves architecture. And I fully disagree. I think that the St. Louis Arch being a temple shows the relationship of, like, Annabeth loves architecture because she's a child of Athena. They're intertwined. Her being a child of Athena and loving architecture go hand in hand. The St. Louis Arch being a temple doesn't take away from the fact that Annabeth loves architecture. When they went to the Arch, Annabeth was raving about all the architectural features of the building. Like, she had her little geek out moment for the St. Louis Arch, and that was really cool to see. Like, they definitely still portrayed how much Annabeth loves architecture. And that's not really something that, like, the book doesn't get into Annabeth's architecture obsession all that much in The Lightning Thief. Besides the St. Louis Arch, the only other thing that really shows Annabeth loving architecture is the game that she plays in the casino, which we'll get to that in a second. But, like, we really get into Annabeth's love for architecture later on in the books, and I think that that's something they're definitely going to continue to portray as we get the opportunity. 2 of the most, like, drastic changes from the books, I would say, are the Tunnel of Love scene and the Lotus Casino scene. And I feel like the purpose of rewriting those scenes differently is because I think Rick and those involved in the writing of the show were able to look at The Lightning Thief through the lens of knowing where all 5 books go, knowing where these character relationships go, both between, like, the demigods and the relationships between the gods. I think this show was an opportunity for Rick and these writers to sort of tackle certain parts of the book that maybe Rick, like, wanted to change or add to or do differently, since he did write the book 20 years ago. Like I said at the beginning of this video, no media is perfect. Everything can be improved. Movies can always be improved, TV shows can always be improved, and books can always be improved. So I do think that, like, changing the Tunnel of Love sequence was Rick changing his writing, but that's because he felt like what he was doing in the show was maybe a sort of better addition to the story. I personally felt like the Tunnel of Love sequence in the show was a better addition to the story. I feel like it evolved Percy and Annabeth a lot, and I liked what it showed us of Hephaestus. Now, when it comes to the Lotus Casino scene, I will totally give this to people that did not like this scene. Like I said, episode 6 was not my favorite episode of the show, but I did really enjoy it. I loved getting to see them talk to Hermes. I thought that that was great. But on the other side of that coin, I do fully understand, like, wanting to see the more fun side of the casino, whether you're one of those people that was like, oh, I love that scene in the movie, or you're somebody that just wanted to see sort of what the book describes. I get that, and I will totally give that to you. I will not take that away from you. I can understand being like, the Lotus Casino was not fun enough. I definitely think they could have added a little bit of more fun things to it. If you go and read the Lotus Casino in the book, though, it really is only like 4 pages, maybe 5 pages, I think. And I think 3 of those pages, Percy is in the hotel part of the casino. He doesn't go down into the casino until later. I think the casino scene is such a small part of the book. I think the show actually kind of shot itself in the foot a little bit by making it a whole episode of the show, because it's such a small section of the book. Like, genuinely it is. I was shocked when the episode titles came out forever ago, and I was like, oh, they're only doing like 1 chapter for A God Buys Us Cheeseburgers, and then 1 chapter for We Bring a Zebra to Vegas. Okay, that's gonna be really interesting to see them spread that out over like a 40-minute episode. And I think they struggled to do that because the Lotus Casino episode was a very short episode of the show. I also think that Rick specifically was trying to make it very opposite from the movie because Rick does not like the movies. He doesn't like how the people involved in the movies treated him over the course of making it. It's less that he like hates the movies. It's more that he just like felt really disrespected by the movies and how like the people writing the movie treated him and his thoughts. Like they just fully disregarded any ideas he had about the script. He has a really great blog post about it that you guys should definitely go and read, where he like shares what he emailed the writers of the movie, and like he got to read the script and he was like, I think that this is bad, I think this is bad, I think this change is fine, I think this change is fine. So like there were changes in the movie that Rick was totally fine with, proving that he's fine with changes happening to his book. There were just certain things in the movie that he didn't like that they changed, or he didn't like how they changed them. And so when he offered his help and he offered his assistance in writing the script, the movie just said no and blocked him out of the creative process. So that's more why Rick hates the movies. Less that they changed things, more of how they treated him. Because on topic of like the show changing things from the book, I saw a lot of people be like, Rick hates the movies so much. Rick said normalize bad movie erasure and then changed his own book in the show. And I'm like, yeah, but that's because his issue with the movies isn't really the fact that they changed things. It's necessarily how they changed it and also how they treated him in the process of making the movies. That's why he hates the movies. But again, that's another story for another time. Long story short, for the Lotus Casino scene, I understand being irritated by the changes from the book. I think that definitely the Lotus Casino scene could have had more fun aspects to it. And I think if they made it a little more fun, maybe that would have made the episode longer. It would have made it better. I still enjoyed it. My favorite parts were with Hermes. Whenever it cut back to Grover, I was like, okay, I'm bored. But I understand critiques of the Lotus Casino episode for sure. I fully understand critiques of that episode. And then the last change from the book that I know a lot of people were annoyed with, and again, I can't really be bothered to defend it, is Krusty. I don't give a flying crap about Krusty. That scene could have never made it into the show, and I would not have batted an eye. I would not have cared one bit. At least in the show, for me, they had a reason for going into Krusty's. In the book, it just felt so stupid to me. I can't even explain it in words how stupid it felt to read that in the book. But in the show, at least there was like a backdoor entrance to the underworld, so they had a reason to go to Krusty's. So at least I felt like we were getting something out of it. But overall, when it comes to changes from the book, I think this critique is one that's hard to like say whether or not it's valid or invalid, because it depends on what critique you're talking about in specifics. It also depends on how you talk about it. This is another one where I feel like you have to be careful how you word it, because when it comes to the changes that were done in the show, for example, we'll use the Tunnel of Love scene. If you really liked how the Tunnel of Love scene happened in the book and you were upset that you didn't get to see that in the show, that's totally valid. If that was like your favorite scene in the book and it was changed in the show, I would probably be upset too. I totally get that. But there's a difference between being like upset that they changed it and being like, oh, the change was bad. I don't really think a lot of the changes that they made from the book were bad. I think that they were made with intent behind them. A lot of people were saying that the writers were just changing things to change them, and I don't think that that's the case. I think that it's very clear, especially if you watch the documentary of the show, I think it's very clear that every single person who has a hand in this show cares a lot about Percy Jackson and the story. I don't think Rick would let this show happen if he didn't feel like people really cared about Percy Jackson. I actually don't think that the writers were just changing things to change them. I think every change that happened was intentional. Whether they changed certain things because they thought that it would like affect character dynamics or cause character growth, or if they changed things like to make things flow better in the show, because like I said, the flow of a book does not translate to the flow of a script. I'm telling you, it's not as easy as you think it would be. You could read the Lightning Thief and think, oh yeah, just one-to-one adapt this to TV. Doesn't work like that. It's actually a lot harder than it looks. But I think every change was intentional, honestly. And you can dislike the changes that were made. I'm not saying that you can't have issues with them and you can't have your opinions on them, because obviously you can. That's totally fine and normal. Like, for example, I think that the Lotus Casino scene could have been more fun. You're allowed to have your opinions on the changes, but it's whether or not you're stating it like it's a fact that the changes were bad, because that's not a fact, that's opinion. And I feel like a lot of my issues with people's issues of the show is seeing people state their issues like it's fact when it's opinion. And I know that that's that's a personal thing. That's a me thing that irritates me, but it's just like annoying. Anyways, moving on. The next complaint that we're going to talk about is the show being too family friendly. And this is actually one that I sort of agree with, and I definitely can understand it. So on one side of this, I can understand certain things being done differently, like decapitating Medusa and Krusty. I can understand that, you know, it's a Disney show and it's made for the general audience of 12-year-olds. Maybe we don't want to cut people's heads off in front of them. That's fine. I get that. I totally get that. But also a good example of like family friendly movies that I actually rewatched relatively recently are the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Those movies are technically like family friendly. Like you would go with your family to the movie theaters to see those movies, but they still have pretty graphic violence and pretty graphic language and relatively adult content. Now I do think there is the slight difference of how in the Pirates movies, you know, the actors are like 20, 30-year-old actors doing the adult things versus in Percy Jackson, you've got actors that are like 12 to 14. So like, I think as the actors grow and as the age of the characters grow, the show can continue to get more and more adult, if that makes sense. I definitely think that this critique of the show being too family friendly is like one of the more valid ones that I heard. And I also think it's easily something that can be worked on and improved. And I think they intend to improve that. Just like as the actors get older, you know, they can just make the theme and the vibes of the show a little bit darker. And also, you know, the books get darker as they go. The kids go through more and more traumatizing things, especially like once you get to the last Olympian. They're in like a full-on war. Like things get serious as we go and go and go. I think things get super serious for me in the Titan's Curse when certain characters die. Like they have like actual character deaths in the Titan's Curse. So I think that that's when things get like super, super serious for me. I feel like it's kind of going to be a little bit like the Harry Potter movies in a way, where the first two Harry Potter movies are serious and there are some intense things that happen to the kids, but overall the vibe of the first two Harry Potter movies are kind of more light and like lighthearted and funny because they're kids. But then once you get to Prisoner of Azkaban, like it gets pretty serious, and from there on out the movies get darker. Literally, you can't see anything in those movies, and they also get darker like in terms of the content. I think that as Percy Jackson progresses in its seasons, the show will start to feel a little bit more adulty because it'll be growing with the actors, it'll be growing with the characters, and it'll get more adult as it goes. But I understand this critique of season 1, and I think that this is a very valid critique. So now the last critique that I want to talk about is a critique that was happening during the show, but it's also something that's happening like actively now, and it's people complaining about the actors aging. And this is specifically about Walker. This is the most crazy complaint in my opinion, by the way. Like people were complaining about how tall Walker had gotten throughout the course of filming Percy Jackson and how it was so obvious when you watch the show, which is true. Walker grew like 7 inches. And right now, like on Twitter, people are starting to complain about how it's going to take too long to film the show and Walker is going to be too old to play Percy. A topic that I could talk about for maybe hours is fandom's like weird obsession with the aging of younger Hollywood actors. This is also something that we're seeing a lot in the Stranger Things fandom. People complaining that like the making of season 5 is taking way too long and how the kids are going to look so old by the time it comes out, when in reality the kids are like 20. Playing like at most 17-year-olds, maybe 16-year-olds, which is not a crazy jump. Same thing with Percy Jackson. Like if Walker is like 20 playing 16-year-old Percy, that's fine. It's especially fine because they started out being 12 and playing 12-year-olds. Like to complain about the passage of time when you're watching a fictional show and you're going to complain about real actors aging because the passage of time outside of a show is different. What are you even saying? Like complaining about Walker growing is so crazy to me because it's like you're watching a show about Greek mythology and gods and monsters, but you draw the line at Walker growing as Percy. That's where we draw the line of like our suspension of disbelief. Hey, that's weird. Get over it. Get over it. He's an actor. We're watching something that's fictional. He's not real. Percy Jackson's not real. So it's fine if Walker grew. And it's fine that it's going to take a while to get to season 5 of this show if we get there. But as long as Walker is willing to play Percy Jackson at an old age, like It's fine. Especially when you look at the history of things existing, like look at the Spider-Man movies. I think Tom Holland was like 19 or 20 when he was casted to play 15-year-old Spider-Man. Same with Tobey Maguire. Tobey Maguire was in his 30s playing a high schooler. Andrew Garfield was in his 30s playing a high schooler. If you look at any TV show, One Tree Hill, Gossip Girl, every actor is like 10 years older than the character they're playing. It's fine. It's literally fine. Just suspend your belief of reality a little bit more. You're just looking at somebody who looks a little bit older. Like, it's fine. It's not a big deal. I think complaining about Walker aging or any of the cast aging is so crazy. I remember seeing people complain about his height, like as the show was going. And I was like, so what? You guys understand you're watching a real boy be a fake character. He's gonna grow. Now, I will admit, I wanted a double season renewal of Percy Jackson so that they could have the added benefit of filming Sea of Monsters and the Titan's Curse back to back. Because yeah, the kids are going to age, and it would be nice to film the show faster. I wish we had that luxury, but we don't, unfortunately. But I just think it's really weird to focus on the aging of an actor, especially when, hey, he's 15. Why are we freaking out about it right now? Why are you freaking out about it at all? He's only 15. I've come to the conclusion, I think, that a lot of people complaining about Walker being 15 because, you know, next year he'll be 16, which is the age that Percy is in The Last Olympian. I've come to the conclusion that people that are freaking out about Walker aging are probably people that are 15 or younger. So they're seeing Walker, somebody who is their age, aging, and that's like making them panic a little bit. But to me, someone who's 24, I look at Walker and I see a baby. Like, he's just a child. He is 15. To me, there's no difference between 12 and 15. Like, you're still a kid. You can't even drive yet. So him being 15 does not faze me in the slightest. But I guess if you are a fan of the show that's like 13 or 14 and you're like, oh my God, Walker was like younger than me when the show started and now he's older than me. Like, I can understand like that maybe freaking you out a little bit, but you don't need to focus on it so much. Like, it's gonna be okay. Oh, also one more that I want to talk about very quickly is a lot of people complain about like the volume screen that was used specifically in the scene between Percy and Ares. The thing about the volume screen is that a lot of people will say that it looks bad and that it's the volume screen's fault, but actually the volume screen is like an incredible feat of technology and it's really useful and can look really good when it's used correctly. I do think that Percy Jackson did a really good job of using the volume screen. I know that the scene between Percy and Ares feels very obvious that it's on a volume screen because the sunset, they like chose to make it like sort of pinkish. I would prefer the sunset to be pretty than have it be like dark and gloomy and being unable to see the fight scene. But if you watch the documentary, the volume screen was actually used in a lot of places where I didn't think it was. And it shocked me to learn like certain places where the volume screen was used. So it's only obvious when I guess it sort of feels like a fake environment. I guess just like the sunset that they chose for the fight between Percy and Ares like made people feel like it looked bad, but it actually did look really good. Something that really bothers me is like when people that really don't know anything, and I'm not saying I do know anything because I don't. I do a lot of research on stuff like this, but I don't work in the industry, so I don't know things exactly. But it bothers me a lot when people who don't know anything about ILM VFX and don't know anything about color grading and how difficult color grading is try and critique things like VFX and color grading. Like, for example, one thing I saw on Twitter, back when the Deadpool 3 trailer came out, someone took one of the scenes from the trailer and was like, this scene looked really bad. I added some color grading to it. And it's really just like they slapped a filter on it. And it's like, that's not what color grading is. Color grading is actually a very tedious process to make it look good. So I can understand being like, oh, the volume screen looked, you know, a little wonky during the Percy and Ares fight. I thought it looked beautiful, but to each their own. But when it comes to overall saying that the volume screen is bad, I disagree. I think that when used correctly, when used with the proper editing and good cinematography and a good director, the volume screen can look really good. And I do think that Percy Jackson used the volume screen really well. I also just think the visual effects of the show looked good. A lot of people tried to say that it didn't, and I think that a lot of people are forgetting the fact that Percy Jackson is a show that takes place in our world For example, I've seen a lot of people comparing the visual effects of the Avatar: The Last Airbender live action show to the Percy Jackson show, and those are kind of insane comparisons to me because Avatar takes place in like a fully, completely fictional world, not anything that we see in our common day, versus Percy Jackson that does take place in our world outside of like Mount Olympus and Camp Half-Blood. They're just in America. They're just at different places in America. So people will complain about Percy Jackson not looking magical enough or not looking mystical enough. And I'm like, there's nothing magical about St. Louis. Sorry, there's nothing magical about the kids running through the streets of Missouri. There's nothing really all that magical about Las Vegas. It's mostly dirty. Like, America is not a magical place. So it makes sense for the show to not necessarily look all that magical because they're not in magical places. They encounter these monsters, which I think looked fantastic. Most notably, I feel like the Chimera was really, really amazing and was done spectacularly because the Chimera was like in broad daylight. The Minotaur looked good, but it was like in the dark and there were like lighting flashes. So it's a little easier to make something like that look good. But I thought that the Chimera looked great. The only visual effects I think that were a little spotty in my opinion were like Medusa's snakes. They looked a little funky, but they still looked good. They could have been better though. But overall, I think the visual effects in the show were fantastic. And I think that they used the volume screen really well. I think that people have to discern the difference between something looking bad and something just like not looking believable, because it's not believable in our world to see monsters. It's just a little bit harder because when you watch something like Avatar, you're seeing these characters and you're seeing these things exist in a fictional world. So you're already like removed further from it. You're like, oh yeah, that could happen in that world. I don't know what this random planet in Star Wars is supposed to look like. So yeah, like I believe whatever I'm looking at. But when it's Percy Jackson, it's a world that we know. It's a world that we live in. So when we see something that we know we wouldn't see in our real life, like a Chimera, like a Minotaur, it's like, oh, that's not realistic to our world, which we're seeing Percy Jackson be in. But it is realistic to their world. It's like a little bit of a harder thing to like wrap your head around, but it does look good. I think the visual effects artists did a really good job on this show. So it really upsets me to like see people try and like critique either the VFX or the ILM VFX. It makes me really sad to like see people try and critique that when like you don't know how hard it is. You don't know how, like, you don't really like fully understand how good it actually does look. I think next season, like, there's going to be a lot more mystical aspects to it because Sea of Monsters is a lot more mystical and magical with, like, Cersei's Island and, like, being in the ocean and whatnot. But for the Lightning Thief, specifically when they're in Missouri and Nevada, like, Long Island, New York, some of the least magical places in America, I think the visual effects looked great. So yeah, I think that about does it for this video of talking about the very surface level critiques of the show. This was a long one. I told you guys at the beginning you needed to strap in. Yeah, basically, there are some critiques that I feel like are pretty valid. A lot of the critiques are like things that are more opinionated, and it bothered me seeing so many people state it as fact when it's not. It's an opinion. But that's not even specific to Percy Jackson. That's just kind of how I feel about a lot of things. There is such a vast difference between being like, I didn't like the writing in the Percy Jackson show. It wasn't for me. And being like, the writing in the Percy Jackson show is bad. I feel like those are vastly different things. Because I've watched some shows with some bad writing. Percy Jackson is not one of them. Percy Jackson is definitely not one of them. If you feel like Percy Jackson writing is bad, you need to watch some shitty TV shows from like the 2010s. But yeah, so a lot of these critiques I feel like were just like more of a problem of how they were phrased instead of what the actual critique was. But then again, some of them I fully disagree with, but that's also me because like I said, all of this is so opinionated and subjective, and it's all just up to you and how you feel. So I just want to talk about how I felt about some of the common critiques that the show got, because I feel like at least what I am told from some of my comments is that I'm one of the more positive voices when it comes to the Percy Jackson show. So I just wanted to explain like why I think some of these critiques are not necessarily valid, or like why some of the things that people don't like actually do make sense to the show if you think about it. All opinion based. If you disagree with anything I said, that's totally fine. That is your opinion. I'm not telling you you're wrong necessarily. I'm just letting you know why I think the show did what it did and why I think the show is good. Real quick before I end the video, once again, I want to give a shout out to my Patreon. Make sure you go check it out. We're going to be posting my full episode reactions to the show. I'm going to be doing commentary tracks for the Percy Jackson show on top of doing commentary tracks and reactions for new shows and movies and stuff that you guys want me to watch, etc., etc. For example, I think a video that I want to do is I haven't seen Madam Web yet, and I heard that it's awful, so I kind of want to do a YouTube video of me reacting to it, but also I'll have my full reaction to the movie like up on my Patreon, so make sure you go subscribe over there so you don't miss anything. But other than that, that does it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.